Psalm 100 opens with the Hebrew words Mizmor le-todah. Mizmor, a psalm. Le, for. Todah. Todah is the word for thanksgiving, for giving thanks. So we could say that Psalm 100 is therefore a psalm for thanksgiving. But Todah could also have a specific meaning, referring to an ancient Israelite sacrifice known as the Todah, the thank offering, where animals were sacrificed to give thanks to the Lord. So Psalm 100 could also be a psalm for a thank offering. Now, these thank offerings were usually offered as part of a joyful ceremony, a Thanksgiving celebration, with songs and rituals and a big celebration. Based on this, we might then say that Psalm 100 is a psalm for a Thanksgiving celebration. All three meanings are present, and together they take us to ancient Jerusalem, to the Israelite temple, where a great crowd of people and priests, maybe also a king, would be gathered outside the gates for a Thanksgiving celebration with a thank offering and hearts full of thanksgiving. Now, the poetry of Psalm 100 is going to take all this thanksgiving and do something unexpected with it. But before we can appreciate that, a bit of background. See, these Thanksgiving celebrations were actually part of a pattern, a rhythm, in ancient Israelite life. In its simplest form, the pattern had 4 parts. Israel faces danger, Israel prays to the Lord helps them, and Israel gives thanks to the Lord. Danger, prayer, help, thanksgiving. Let's look quickly at the example of King Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles 20. The story begins with the danger of enemies, the Moabites and Ammonites, coming to destroy King Jehoshaphat and Judah, a great and mighty army. Jehoshaphat and Judah pray to the Lord, and the Lord helps them, miraculously defeating their enemies. How then did Judah and Jehoshaphat respond? They returned to Jerusalem with joy, for the Lord had made them rejoice over their enemies. They came to Jerusalem with harps, lyres, and trumpets to the house of the Lord, to the Jerusalem temple. So God's joyful people arrive at the temple. And what would they do there? Another verse from Jeremiah 33 completes the picture. Here also God's people are full of joy in coming to the house of the Lord, to the Jerusalem temple, with a voice of joy and a voice of gladness, saying, "Give thanks to the Lord of hosts, for the Lord is good, for his loyalty is forever," as they bring a todah, a thank offering, into the house of the Lord. And with that, we come to Psalm 100. Now, we cannot know for sure, but it's most probable that it's at the point of preparation, when the people are still outside the gates, that Psalm 100 might have been recited, just before the people entered God's house to present their thank offering. Enter before him with exultation. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name. Perhaps spoken by a priest or leader, perhaps standing in or next to the gate. So what is Psalm 100 then all about? Well, thanksgiving, right? A psalm for a thank offering, for todah. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, with todah. Give thanks to him, hodu, from the same word as todah. But now we come to the surprise of the poetry of Psalm 100. What if Psalm 100 isn't actually about thanksgiving? What if the poetry of Psalm 100 is doing something a little different? You see, Hebrew poetry has different ways of telling us what is most important, what is at the heart, at the center of a psalm, and what flows out from that center. What if we could see that the poetry of Psalm 100 doesn't place thanksgiving at the center, but instead thanksgiving flows out from that center? Let's look at some of the ways that Psalm 100 tells us where its center point is. The first way is Psalm 100's chiastic structure. Chiastic structures create symmetry between mirroring sections, like an A, B, C, D, C, B, A pattern, where the beginning and end, the A sections match each other, then the inner sections B and B and C match each other, and then the middle D section stands out as the center point. When we read the Hebrew of Psalm 100 carefully, it seems to also have this kind of chiastic structure. The clearest repetition is the repeated invitation to enter. Enter before him with exultation, and enter his gates with thanksgiving. The Hebrew of these two lines doesn't just start with the exact same word, bo. They mirror each other almost perfectly. Bo, lefanav, she'arav, be, renana, toda. The sounds of the words match, the meaning of the words match, the syntax, the arrangement of the words match. We'll call these the repeated C lines in the chiasm, as we also have matching A and B lines. For the B lines, both end with the matching words b'simha and b'tehillah, with joy and with praise. For the matching A lines, the form and pattern of the commands for shout joyfully and give thanks also match. On top of all of this, the chiastic structure of Psalm 100 can also be seen in the chain of 7 commands around which it is built. Shout joyfully, serve, enter, acknowledge, enter, give thanks, and bless. These 7 commands are also arranged with a chiastic structure, with the first 2 matching the last 2 as different words for worship and praise, then the repeated enter commands matching each other, and then the center point of the pattern is the command in which verse? Verse 3. The center point and the middle section of the chiasm. Acknowledge that the Lord, He is God. He made us, and we are His people and the flock of His pasture. The poetry of Psalm 100 is then pointing to these words as the heart of the psalm. And you can see our resource page for even more ways that happens, elevating this verse 3 as the central prominent point of the psalm, like the tip of a pyramid. And what is the message in these words at the tip of the pyramid? We belong. We, Israel, belong to the Lord. He made us, and we are His people, and the flock of His pasture. Let's come back to the temple, to the great crowd gathered outside the gates, preparing to enter in and present their thank offering with joyful songs of thanksgiving. It is here, at this point of preparation for thanksgiving, that Psalm 100 might be giving us the very foundation of thanksgiving, belonging. Israel might say, we faced danger, we prayed to the Lord, He helped us. Come, let us enter His courts and give thanks for His help with a thank offering. But wait, before we enter, we must remember that all of this flows out of something so much deeper. We're not just thanking Him for this specific act of help, for this specific blessing, for this specific salvation. Our deepest thankfulness comes from the truth that we belong to Him. He is our God, and we are His people. He is our shepherd, and we are His sheep. The Lord's help and blessings might come and go, but this truth never changes. And that is the surprise of the poetry of Psalm 100. The psalm for thanksgiving, for a Thanksgiving celebration, is ultimately a celebration of belonging. Now, up to this point, we have been reading the psalm as speaking to Israel. The psalm is calling Israel to serve the Lord with joy, to enter before Him, to acknowledge that He is God, and to enter His gates with thanksgiving and His courts with praise. However, scholars are divided about whether this psalm addresses Israel or the Gentiles, all nations of the earth. Shout joyfully to the Lord, all the earth, is then an address to all who dwell on the earth, the Gentiles. And it's in fact the Gentiles who are being invited to serve the Lord with joy, to enter before Him, to acknowledge that He is God, and to enter His gates with thanksgiving. Now, this issue is complicated, and you can see our detailed presentation of this issue in our free online resources. The conclusion is that it is more likely addressed to Israel, as we've seen so far. But the arguments for reading it as addressed to all nations are actually very strong and entirely plausible as well. In fact, it might even be possible that the poetry of Psalm 100 was intentionally designed to be ambiguous. That there could have even been a layered invitation in this psalm, first to Israel and then to all nations. Every single line of Psalm 100 can plausibly be read as addressing either Israel or the nations. Just as Israel was often commanded to serve the Lord with joy, so too all the nations would be commanded to serve the Lord with joy and to enter before him to worship. And that would be very similar to Psalm 2, in which the kings of the earth are commanded to serve the Lord with fear and trembling. Just as Israel was often called to acknowledge the Lord as God, in verse 3, people everywhere might have been invited to acknowledge that the Lord alone was God, reflecting a common refrain for all nations to do exactly that throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, as in 1 Kings 8. Also in verse 3, the confession that the Lord made us could be Israel speaking, as we have in many verses, but it could also resonate, for example, with Jeremiah 27, in which the Lord makes the earth and its people, all its people. In verse 4, all the nations are invited to enter his gates and courts, just as they were invited a few psalms before in Psalm 96. All the nations are commanded to thank the Lord, as we also find in Psalm 67. The command to bless the Lord also extends to all nations, as we see in Psalm 66. It's possible then that Psalm 100 was designed to be heard in ancient Israel by Israelites as their psalm using their language for one of their Thanksgiving celebrations. And yet, for those who had ears to hear, the psalm invited them to remember that their story was never just about them. From the very beginning, God chose Israel to bless all the earth, all the families of the earth, looking to the day when all peoples with Israel will enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise.